My name is Gavin Jones. I'm a senior in the Department of Biology, Geology, and Environmental Sciences, and my research was on quantifying APA violations in environmental rulemaking during the Trump presidency. I conducted this research over the course of this last semester under the advisement of Dr. Carol Bassetti. A little bit of policy terminology before we get started. The APA is the Administrative Procedure Act. This is a piece of legislation that was enacted in 1946, and it dictates the federal rulemaking process. So a couple of things that federal agencies must do before they enact any rule on the federal level. They have to provide adequate public notice of this proposed rule change. This is done through posting a proposal in the Federal Register, which is a website where the public has access to these rule postings. They then have to allow the public the chance to voice their concerns about the proposed rule. This can be done a number of ways. Most of the time, they just allow commenting on the actual Federal Register proposed rule. Other times, they hold public hearings in which they allow people to attend in person to voice their concerns. They have to notify the public of when these hearings are going to take place and where and how they can attend. And then finally, they have to address all of the categories of those concerns in the final rule posting in the Federal Register before they can enact any rule change. What we set out to do was investigate an accusation. This accusation was from a number of environmental watchdog groups, and they accused the Trump administration of frequently failing to follow the guidelines that I just described to you from the APA, specifically in the process of environmental rulemaking. This, of course, lends itself to two basic questions. Are these accusations true? And if those are true and these violations are taking place, how frequently are these rules being broken? So we've made it our mission to try to quantify these rule violations, if in fact they do exist at all. A little bit of methodology. Of course, our goal was to explore the federal environmental rulemaking process and try to quantify these violations. Initially, that meant finding these rule changes to begin with. So we had to go into the Federal Register, find these rulings, sort them into categories. So we looked at those that had already been overturned for APA violations. There were a group that had never been challenged in the courts, and then there was a larger group that was currently under review. We then focused our efforts on the ones that are currently under review and conducted our own analysis as to whether or not we felt these rule changes had violated those APA guidelines. As far as discovering and categorizing these rule changes, this is a fairly lengthy process. So if you have no experience with the Federal Register, every agency that makes a change on the federal level has to have a proposed ruling posted in the Federal Register. Over the course of 4 years, we're talking about tens of thousands of rule postings. So we had to sort those and find the ones that specifically pertain to the environment. After we did that, we had to read a lot of case study to see which ones had already been overturned for these violations. The general summary of what I'm telling you is that there was a lot of reading involved. Once we had our categories broken apart, we narrowed to the ones that were currently under review and began to look for violations. First off, we looked to see whether or not the agency proposing this rule change provided adequate public notice about this rule change. So before they enact a rule change, they have to post it in the register. Then, did they allow for comments? Did they provide the public with notice of where they could address their comments to, or what they needed, a seminar that they needed to attend, for example, to be able to voice these concerns, or whether or not they were accepting comments on the Federal Register post? Also, did they address all categories of comments in the final ruling if they were allowing people to comment at all? To do this, we had to read every single comment on every one of these rules. One ruling alone had 660,000 comments. Several rulings had more than 10,000 comments. We looked at all in all roughly 1.3 million comments that we had to read and categorize, and then look into the final ruling and analyze the comment section to see whether or not we felt these federal agencies had done a job as thorough as we did. Now on to the results. This table here shows a breakdown of all of the environmental alterations made by agencies during the Trump administration. A lot of these are common sense. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, you would expect to make a lot of environmental rule changes. The Department of the Interior, mainly through the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management, is not that surprising. The Department of Energy, you might expect, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But a couple of these are a little surprising. So you wouldn't think that the Department of Justice, the Department of Labor, or the Department of the Treasury would be too involved in the environmental rulemaking process. As far as the Treasury is concerned, for example, the Treasury decides funding. And if the Treasury wants to enact a rule change to pull funding from an environmental program, that is a rule change that pertains to the environment, and we looked at that too. There were also a list of 20 alterations that we included in this table that were not eligible for the APA. So these were all executive orders. A lot of times executive orders just provide guidance to federal agencies on how to conduct their daily operation. And because of that, no rule change is associated with them, and therefore they aren't eligible for the APA. We just felt that it was necessary to add these just to get an idea of how frequently they were making alterations to environmental regulations. Here's the breakdown of what we found when we categorized those comments, the rulings. 17 of them had actively been overturned in the courts for APA violations. 26 at the time of our analysis had never been challenged. That left us with 47 of the 90 APA eligible rule changes that were currently under review, and we then focused on those 47. Of those 47, they were separated by 7 different agencies which had rules currently under review. The most frequently, the EPA had 31 of its rules currently under review. Through our analysis, we found that 16 of them failed to provide public notice on how to comment your concerns about that ruling, and another 12 failed to address all categories of comments. The Department of the Interior, as I said earlier, broken up into the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management, had 5 currently under review, violated 4 times. We also found violations from the Department of Labor, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Department of Transportation. We also saw, which you're not going to see in this table, are some trends. So generally speaking, the higher the number of comments there were in the ruling, the less likely they were to address all categories of comments. So I told you earlier that we found one ruling where there were 660,000 comments. That, as you might have imagined, did not have all of its comments addressed. There was also a trend where agencies tend to not address comments that call into question the science behind their ruling. So if there was some sort of scientific question as to whether or not this ruling would be best for the environment, those comments were generally ignored as well. This table is a total breakdown of violations as sort of a summary of our quantification. If you take the 17 rulings that had already been overturned in the courts, the 17 that we found provided no public notice, and the 19 that we found failed to address all categories of comments. That brings us to a total of 53 violations out of 90 environmental rule changes during the 4 years that the Trump administration was in office. A few take-home points. Agencies within the Trump administration violated the APA almost 60% of the time that they proposed environmental rules. Another trend we noticed that I'm sure you saw in the graph was that the EPA in particular regularly violated the APA. So they, of their 31 rulings currently under review, violated, according to our analysis, 28 times out of 31, which is roughly 90%. So which brings us to our final question of whether or not the accusations against the administration were founded. If you recall, the accusation was that the administration had frequently failed to follow APA guidelines during the environmental rulemaking process. So whether or not we think the accusations are founded depend on our definition of the word frequently. This occurred roughly 60% of the time, as I've said a few times already. So my opinion is that yes, that would count as frequently. One note about further direction in this project. We do plan to conduct some further analysis within previous administrations, just as sort of a comparison to see whether or not this administration had committed these violations any more frequently than other previous administrations had. And that is all I have for you. Thank you very much for listening.